issue of multiple tiers of the supply chain, supplier.
In the relationship management, there has to be a decision.
The topic is the new world of supplier relationship management, and my guest is Dennis Snyder. He is General Manager of Lighting and Decorative Hardware for Kohler Company. Dennis, welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
How are companies approaching the whole issue of supplier relationship management today?
Well, what I've found is that many companies treat supplier relationships a bit too haphazardly, meaning they treat them as strictly a business transaction relationship, or they look at their suppliers as how to always try to wring costs out of them. And what I recommend is that they take a more structured approach of understanding where the relationship stands with a supplier, and then how to develop a structure that says how to best utilize that supplier for their business purposes, for both businesses.
Of course, that requires a dictum from on high. Procurement people and supplier relationship people are under pressure to cut costs because that's what the folks above them tell them to do. You know, as of tomorrow, you will cut a procurement cost by 10% or something like that. How do you get that message up to the executive suite that we need to take a new approach to supplier relationship management?
Well, in many cases, if you're just looking at the total cost of a supplier and their products to you, you may not be leveraging their capabilities for new product development, or you may not be leveraging opportunities where they may have resources in engineering or other activities that they could provide greater value to your business, but they're not able to fund those or demonstrate those to you because you're really only looking at them from a cost standpoint.
So in other words, you have to get that message up to the executive suite of the
Yes.
importance of true supplier partnerships.
It's total value out of a supplier, not only just total.
Is there a trend these days of including the concept of risk management into supplier relationships?
Yeah, there absolutely has to be, Bob. When you look at supplier relationship, it's not just their performance for you and their metrics. It's also having some forward-looking visibility to expected problems. It's anticipation of issues that you have to incorporate into a risk system that allows you to understand where to proactively take measures. Those could be something related to supply chain risk, something as potentially invisible as capacity issues, to things that might be financial risk of solvency, or even the possibility that they're not protecting your IP as effectively as they should.
So you cannot have a true risk management strategy until you know your suppliers.
You have to know this.
How do you come to know your suppliers? How do you really figure out who's out there, who's giving you what price, where they are, all that kind of stuff?
It's a very thorough metric system, as well as being willing to ask difficult questions. In some cases, businesses assume that the supplier is managing their business correctly. There may be things that the supplier is not looking at that when you ask those questions, you trigger the thought. The light comes on the supplier, and I've found that suppliers will be willing to share information if you make the question very clear and obvious.
Then there's the issue of multiple tiers of the supply chain, sub-suppliers. What do we do to get visibility of that, which is so often the case that companies do not have that, and may indeed be surprised to find that a so-called sub-supplier is even making product for them?
Yeah, in the relationship management, there has to be a decision, a point that you say, this is the supplier that I choose to work with, and I want to develop the trust with that supplier, that they'll be open and sharing with lower tier level suppliers. If you have ulterior motives, suppliers aren't dumb. They'll see them, they'll sort it out, and then you start to see the blocks come up in terms of gathering or collecting information.
So I guess another initial step you need to take is assessing just who are your primary and most important suppliers. That would be step one in terms of so-called knowing your suppliers, correct?
Yeah, I recommend using a strategy that says you segment your supply base to understand who your core partners are, who are the partners that you'd like to grow because of capabilities, capacities, or other opportunities they can develop for you, what suppliers you'd like to leverage, and only leverage because they may be potentially serving a competitor, and you don't want to invest the resources to develop them or teach them to be a better supplier for a competitor, and what suppliers you should be evaluating and monitoring closely, either as a new supplier or because there's some risk that's unacceptable or performance that's unacceptable.
How important is it that companies avoid being trapped in a sole supplier situation? Sometimes, indeed, they have no choice, but to the extent that they can diversify somewhat, should they not be looking at that? as a hedge against supplier interruptions down the line?
You know, I find that the question about sole source versus dual source is as difficult to answer as centralized or decentralized functions in a corporate office. You really have to look at your business model. You have to understand who your supplier partners are and whether or not there's a risk of being sole sourced that would provide a severe interruption in your supply chain. Those are things that you have to assess in that relationship and say, okay, do I really need to begin looking outside? Because once you take that step, I think it's important to know that there could be consequences, there could be ripples effect that could affect that relationship with the supplier forever. I'm not suggesting you don't do that. I'm suggesting that you really have to assess and understand the situation before you automatically take that action.
But the last thing you want to be doing is knocking on the door of a supplier with whom you have no relationship in an emergency situation saying, please help me. That supplier isn't necessarily going to jump, are they?
That's correct. And today, there are many companies that have decades of supplier relationship. And when you've built that length of relationship with suppliers, you'll find that they'll be the ones that will respond to you as long as you've maintained a strong relationship with them. Those are your core partner suppliers that I recommend you understand who those are, so that when you have an issue or you see an issue, they're the people that you count on to react. If you're looking to make that ask of a supplier that you leverage, remember they're receiving the same ask from potentially multiple competitors of yours. And they'll then evaluate who they prioritize based on business level.
Yeah. Vetting suppliers is of course crucial, but how does one ensure continued performance and quality from a supplier with which you now have a relationship?
It's open, transparent metric sharing. I think it's very important that the transparency of data you collect and information that they see that you reply to them on, for example, on-time delivery performance or shipment performance, quality of performance, very important that that's transparent to both parties, so that then you can move beyond whether or not the metric's accurate and begin working on how to improve that metric and drive sustained performance over time.
Are you keeping the report card on that supplier, or are you asking that supplier to assess its own performance?
It's both. So I would recommend that you maintain that scorecard, that you share the scorecard with the supplier, but then you actually also circle back with them to make sure that their assessment of their own performance is aligned to what you as the customer needs to see.
And don't you want to know about the supplier's concerns in a relationship too? You cannot be constantly cracking the whip over a supplier in a one-way relationship. So how important is it to get supplier feedback about concerns about why they might not be able to fulfill your expectations because of something that's going on at their end?
That's absolutely important to do. You have to understand, are you a customer that's easy to do business with? Because that does affect a lot of things in the relationship. Things such as new product development or things related to performance for you. Costs are certainly a factor of whether or not you are an easy customer to do business with. Companies don't often look at it from that standpoint, but it is an important factor to consider as they're developing these strategies and deploying them.
So what's our takeaway here in terms of a company migrating from a current supplier relationship that certainly leaves something to be desired to a framework whereby they are a more active partner? How can companies start that process?
First, it's deciding that you want to manage your supply base with intent, not just always driving costs or specific performance measurements. It's understanding where your relationship stands with the supplier, assessing risk on several fronts: new product development, business stability, supply chain risk, and then understanding how important that supplier is to your business through a number of factors. When you have that understanding, then you can begin assessing where they fit in your strategy. Are they a partner? Are they someone that you will grow? Somebody that you're leveraging because of their capabilities? Or somebody that you really need to seriously evaluate whether they'll be your supplier long term?
Great points and a great start too. Dennis Snyder, thank you very much for being with us to explain kind of the ins and outs of modern day supplier relationship management. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
I have been speaking with Dennis Snyder of Kohler Co. Thank you very much for watching.